right, thanks. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and especially to Michael Wood, our guest speaker from OSHA. So there's a lot of questions, of course, a lot of misinformation, information floating around. So if you could just kind of start with what your main job is at OSHA and what you look for.
So the Oregon Occupational Safety and Health Division, which is a part of the Department of Consumer and Business Services, we refer to ourselves as Oregon OSHA because that's our parallel with the federal agency. We are actually responsible for enforcing workplace safety and health protections throughout Oregon. And unlike some agencies where, like environmental law and some wage protection laws, both federal and state agencies have jurisdiction, the way it works in OSHA law is we have an approved state plan and we are essentially the federal designee. Technically, I am the federal designee, but so federal OSHA does not do enforcement within our jurisdiction. And what that means is that federal OSHA in Oregon does enforcement on some maritime, on Native American reservations, and then they have responsibility over all federal employees while we have responsibility for state and local government employees. So that's it in a nutshell. Public health isn't our jurisdiction, but where the interface of public health creates risks to both workers and patrons, we end up having the levers that can address that because of the worker safety and health jurisdiction. And that's really how we have ended up addressing issues within the OSHA context. Now, what that's meant over time, just to give you an example, is there certainly have been issues that have come to our attention as complaints that at the time were clear violations of the governor's executive order and of public health guidance, but that we couldn't address because there wasn't an issue of worker exposure. The most obvious one being if somebody had, actually I think we may have gotten one about a party or an event in the park in Lincoln City. But there were no employees involved, so we could only hand that to public health officials and back to the local jurisdiction. So if you'd like, I've got just a couple slides that will give you a little bit of a sense of what that workload has looked like. They're slightly dated, but they'll give you a decent picture.
Okay.
So, can you enable my screen sharing?
Oh, maybe.
If not,
Did that work?
no, it's still treating me as a participant. So,
And I'm getting your screen sharing. I don't know.
well, you are sharing your screen.
Oh, okay. Then I don't want to do that.
Yeah. Well, you probably want to turn that off so that we're not all looking.
Right.
If I get boring and you decide to check your emails, we can all help you respond. But, screen share function can be a nuisance on occasion. Well, I will just talk through the issues then. If I can, let's see, I need to exit full screen so I can get back to. So I can.
Now I need to get back. I don't know. Stop share. Okay, there we go.
We have received over since the beginning of March, we've tracked COVID complaints separately with a code in our system. And we've now received more than 5,000 complaints.
Wow.
Probably in the neighborhood of 2/3 of those are about or on behalf of workers. And a total of about 75 to 80% are about workplaces and workplace exposures. Now, to give you some context, in a normal year, we get about 2,000 complaints. So that's about 40 complaints a week. The week after the governor issued the stay home, stay safe order, we went from a total of all complaints. It was a little high. We'd had 76 complaints the week before, and we had about 1,350 the week that it was issued. We've settled down now to where we're only getting about 250 complaints, so 4 or 5 times our normal. or 6 times our normal. But when we visited 1,250, 1,300 along the way, that doesn't seem quite as shocking as it would have if we'd gone there immediately. Surprisingly, our system didn't really break. We were able to handle it. Fortunately, most of those complaints came in through the web, which made it easier for us to triage and manage the flow with our staff decentralized. We'd also, to some degree, minimized our actual presence in workplaces because we didn't want to introduce additional sources of contamination. So we were still out there, but not as often and not as frequently in as many locations. So that meant we had staff who could also scale up, and processing those complaints during that 2-week period when it stayed around 1,200. And basically we got well over a year's worth of complaints in 2 weeks. We were able to staff up and address that with a fairly minimal delay in our responses. In normal times, we respond to complaints either with an inspection or with an investigation, and at least initially, and that investigation will be either a phone contact or perhaps just a letter. Because of the volume, as well as because of the fact that we were talking in most workplaces about new expectations that employers were still trying to understand, it made sense to make a virtue out of necessity, and we handled virtually everything by a phone fax, what we call a phone fax inquiry. It's actually phone email, but we named it 20 years ago. So, and so we'll make a telephone contact and then follow up with an electronic contact and ask for an employer response. Always holding on to the possibility that we may still choose to do an inspection, and we don't tell employers whenever we're going to do inspections. So once in a while, we'll be in the midst of a phone fax response, and because of an additional complaint or what we hear or a sense that we're not really getting told the whole story, we may go ahead and initiate a complaint. More commonly, we'll look at the response after we get it and decide that we need to complain, that we need to inspect, perhaps based on additional information we've gotten from the complainant.
So when you get a complaint in, you send it to the business and allow them to respond, right?
Typically, that is what is happening now.
Okay.
That is a guarantee. And in our normal process, it happens about half the time. With COVID-19 complaints, it's happening almost every single time. Or if we pursue it at all. I mean, there are some issues, as we were talking about earlier, that are clearly outside our jurisdiction, and we don't pursue those. But yeah, we have been reaching out. And so just to give you a sense, out of those 5,000 complaints, we have conducted about 36 inspections. So it isn't like we've been, on the one hand, we want people to know that there's a possibility of inspection, and we may come out, we may inspect, and depending on problems, we may cite. Out of those 36 inspections, we have cited to date 8 employers for issues directly related to COVID. We've concluded about 24 of the inspections. The other dozen are open.
Can you speak to what some of those fines were?
I actually have a cute thing I could even share, except
Sorry.
I can't. But I can actually kind of run through the list and talk about them. So we cited several establishments, a couple furniture stores, because they were actually operating in violation of the executive order, the plain language of it. They had convinced themselves that they somehow had an exception or had retuned their operations so that what they were doing was appropriate. So one of those penalties on April 20th was $175, and another one on June 1st was $280. We also cited an entertainment facility called Honeysuckle's Lingerie, an adult entertainment club, which didn't believe that they were covered as either a club or a theater, and felt like they were appropriately implementing social distancing. We did indicate to them they were operating in violation of the executive order, and we penalized them $100. Now, the other end of that is there have been 3 employers that we were there because we got complaints, but the reason the complaints were generated is they had very publicly and visibly announced that they were done complying with the executive order and they were going to open. And so 2 of those were restaurants. One of them, the minimum penalty for a willful violation, and it was really no way we could classify these as anything but willful. The minimum penalty for a willful violation is $8,900. And so both those restaurants were cited an $8,900 penalty. One of them also continued to operate after we hung a red warning notice. And so they received an additional $5,000 penalty for that. The other one probably would have continued to operate, but by the time we were closing the inspection, it took us about 2 weeks to do it. They actually were on the verge of being able to legally reopen because of the phased reopening schedule. So they didn't, we didn't issue a red warning notice to make them close for half a day. And then the other one, anybody who's read any Salem news or watches TV news in Portland knows that there was a salon in Salem here that very publicly chose to open and actually recruited armed guards. We ended up citing them with a willful violation that totaled $15,000. They weren't cited for violating a red warning notice because we didn't hang one, because we endeavored to do the entire inspection without actually approaching the site, given the issues involved. So those are sort of the people think there are big ticket penalties out there. Those were all willful violations. For other folks, we've obviously, they're small employers, and so they've gotten relatively modest penalties. And then there's a couple food processors. One we've cited, and another one is in process. National Frozen Foods in Albany, we did cite $2,000. They weren't operating in violation of the they were able to be open, but we felt that they weren't addressing known health hazards adequately on one of the lines in the plant, even in the face of positive cases. And so they were cited $2,000, which for an employer of their size is still a pretty modest penalty. And then there was a mill in kind of a similar situation down south that we cited for, I believe, $630. So that's the entire COVID-19 enforcement picture, at least in terms of the citations we've issued. Much more significant are all the employers that we were able to get into compliance and to help understand the requirements based on the phone inquiries and the back and forth discussion. The story really isn't about those 9 or 10 employers. It's about the 4,000 others that we engaged with, and we were able to get constructive results. And that's continued to be the perspective we've taken as we've moved into reopening. We're still looking at addressing things in the context of, when we do an inspection, we're no longer in we may just warn you, education before enforcement model. The law actually says if we identify a violation during an inspection, we have to cite it. And if it's a serious violation, it has to carry a penalty of at least $100. Serious violations maximum penalty, if it's not willful, is $12,750. Obviously, none of these penalties approach that. Even the willful penalties were considerably lower than that. And the maximum penalty for a willful violation is actually $125,749. So even the willful violations were very much at the low end of our statutory authority. And that's based on the risk and the size of the employers and the nature of the hazard. There are a lot of factors that go into it.
So now that things are getting back open, kind of what are the new things that you're seeing out there?
Well, so one of the biggest complaints we get, and I'm sure that will continue as the new guidance takes effect tomorrow, is around facial coverings, the cloth face coverings. The purists among us will say they're not masks. They're certainly not respirators. They're not personal protective equipment. But when there are multiple employees, they're obviously a source of potential infection for one another as well as for customers. And so that's really one of the areas that we're getting complaints on and that we're looking at a lot. There are still fewer than there used to be, but there are still a number of complaints coming in where it's basically, I know my coworker, I'm sure my coworker has COVID and the employer won't tell us anything. And we frequently end up in those cases sort of educating the complainant over the fact that there are restrictions on what an employer can tell workers about somebody else's health condition. And then and then there are, there are still folks in the counties that aren't fully open who are choosing to accelerate the schedule. And so we did have, we're doing inspections and have gotten complaints in some Multnomah County businesses who thought it was unfair that the rest of the state was in phase one and they weren't. And so we've had to address some of those issues. From a regulatory standpoint, those are actually fairly simple because the proof is fairly easy. I mean, if you're required to be closed and you're open, that's a fairly easy case. Assessing whether somebody's enforcing appropriate use of cleaning and sanitation practices is a more complicated fact pattern and something that we'll have to spend more time in work sites talking to employees and actually assessing than we've had to for some of the enforcement we've done so far, in the event that we do an inspection. Most of those we're addressing in the same way as we've been addressing other issues.
So are you finding you're getting more complaints from employees or customers?
We're getting more complaints from employees. I did a thorough analysis about 2/3 of the way in, and I'm having looked at the complaints as they come in, I'm sure it hasn't changed. 50% were clearly from employees or their representatives. 19% were clearly from customers or concerned citizens. I mean, in some cases, it literally was people on the street looking over and seeing a business open that either wasn't supposed to be open or that they believed wasn't supposed to be open. And then the remainder were anonymous. And we'll take confidential complaints. When I use the word anonymous, what I mean is we don't know who the complainant is either. Out of those, I'd say that actually probably about 2/3 of those were employees or employees' family members. And so if you take it as a whole, it looks like right in the neighborhood of 2/3 of the complaints that we've received are from employees or their people speaking on behalf of employees. And then about half of the customer complaints are actually about our customers complaining about employee exposures. So there are a significant number of customer complaints that really are, this restaurant, this fast food place isn't protecting its employees, and they aren't a complaint about the point of customer contact. They're a complaint about what they can see through the drive-through window. And we've been getting those all along as well.
Interesting. So how much, there's been a lot of questions about enforcement of the mask wearing, and we are here in Lincoln County, one of those counties that were required to have masks. So can you kind of speak to that and what the business owners onus on that whole thing is?
Well, so, I think the clearest thing is that it makes it clear that business owners have the right to enforce mask wearing or facial covering wearing. And we would expect them to do so. I mean, the face covering doesn't protect the customer, it protects the workers and others with whom they come into contact. So we do view that as a worker protection issue. If there's only one customer and one employee, then face covering on the employee isn't the one that protects workers. It's the face covering on the customer that does. And so for example, my wife, when she reopened her retail store, she's required face coverings from the beginning, and she got a supply of disposables in, and it was one of the things she made sure she had in place. You know, she was, like many retail businesses, she wasn't strictly required to close by the stay home, stay safe order. She chose to close and just go to a curbside and delivery model. And then she reopened really a week after the retail businesses that were closed could reopen. And frankly, she's actually had a pretty easy time. The nature of her customers, the relation she has with her customers, if she's got and the way she communicates with them, if she's got regular customers who aren't willing to wear a face covering, they appear to be staying home. And I know there are folks who, try to actively organize boycotts. And so we'd expect an employer to make a genuine effort to actually enforce the requirement and to deny people service if they're refusing to wear a face covering, and if there isn't a medical condition or other disability at least claimed that prevents it. And that does get dicey. It's easier when you're talking about employees. I mean, we have one restaurant down in Southern Oregon that apparently all its 10 or 12 employees suffer from a medical disability that prevents them from wearing a mask. When you're talking about ADA, the employer has an ability to inquire and to ask for medical documentation. As I understand it, and I'm not an attorney and this is outside my normal scope of law, a business really doesn't have that ability to inquire about a patron other than to confirm that there's a disability that prevents them from wearing the mask. But then you can engage in a conversation about alternate ways to provide the service. You don't have to simply let everyone who shows up wander the store or engage with your staff in the same way if they're not protected by a mask.
Right. We've got a question in the chat. Since we are a county that is mandated to wear masks starting this week, are businesses and employers required to provide the masks?
You are required to provide masks, facial coverings for your employees. You are not required to provide them for the general public. My wife got a bunch of lightweight disposable masks that look a lot like procedure masks that medical providers would wear, but they're not medical grade. And she does provide them, but that is not actually required.
It's a nice thing to have if you have someone come in without it. Here's one.
Easier to have the conversation where you say, you have to wear a facial covering, and if you don't have one, I've got one right here. Now her store also is a low enough volume operation that she has people coming in through the back door and then exiting through the front door. And that's less about one-way traffic than it is the front door has to remain unlocked during business hours and the back door has a lock on it. It's always been her handicapped access. And so that way people ring the doorbell, she greets them, has the conversation about what's there. And she is restricting the number of people in the store at a time. That's only become an issue a few times where she actually had folks who wanted to be there that she had to have wait. And she's encouraging people to schedule an appointment. It's a arts and craft, paper crafting, mixed media supply store. So it does tend to be people coming in and spending a lot of time looking at products and then making purchases. She has fewer browsers who just wander into the store. And for her market segment, that loss isn't a critical issue. I think the nature of some of the businesses in your area, and certainly during the holiday season, you rely more on getting people to drop in and and then getting your hooks into them while they're there. If you've got people who are resistant to masks, that's going to be an issue.
So is there a limit to the number of customers that can be in the store? I know some stores are, some stores aren't. So what's the mandate on that?
There isn't actually a mandate. There's a recommendation that you determine how many people can be in your store. But there isn't a specific. Now I'm saying there's not a mandate. Now I'm thinking there actually is a mandate. You're supposed to make the determination. But you are free to make that determination based on your assessment of your space, your assessment of your traffic flow, your assessment of the nature of the way people interact with the product and with each other. And so there isn't it's not like there's specific square footage guidance or something like that. I was able to sit in on some of the conversations as the governor's office developed that guidance. And that was one of the struggles, is that retail businesses are radically different from one another. And the nature of the customer interaction is very different. And then you look in, when you look at large general merchandise stores, they've got a lot of square footage. They've still got the greatest population in their grocery department. And so, putting more people in the grocery section because there's a bunch of space off in clothing that's not being used, it really doesn't structure itself well to any sort of mandate. So it makes the most sense to have employers do a genuine assessment. And I know that my wife started and thought that she might increase it when she got a better sense of how people interacted. When back before the stay home, stay safe order, she'd actually made the decision to close her doors to the public because she was having a very difficult time getting customers to honor social distancing. I mean, literally to the point where like one of her employees was sort of backing up through the store, holding her hand up as the customer kept approaching. And so she'd already made the decision that she was going to go to the delivery and curbside model for a while.
So is that an inspection that you would make if you got a complaint that a store had too many people in it? Or is that something you would follow up on?
We would assess it about whether or not they were able to maintain social distancing. The limit on the number of people in the store is a mechanism to enable you to achieve and enforce the 6-foot social distancing for most of the time people are in the store. And so that's really the context we'd look at it. And if it was just, I think they're letting too many people in the store, they're letting more people in than other stores are, that would generate an inspection. It probably would generate a conversation with the employer about what are you doing, and how does the traffic flow work. I mean, obviously I benefit in some respects from my wife having had this experience from the other side of it. She thought about building a one-way traffic pattern in her shop, and decided that wasn't going to be workable. And so she ended up not doing that. Some people do it. And we get complaints occasionally that say, they're using the same doors for exit and entrance because they've seen other stores that aren't doing that. Well, there's no requirement you do that. And my experience at my local grocery store is that people do a decent job with face coverings. The employees are all wearing face coverings. People do a decent job with social distancing. But if they drove on one-way streets, the way they pay attention to the one-way arrows in the grocery store aisles, we'd have a lot more traffic fatalities.
Right. So how about the plexiglass barriers in, say, an office?
They're not, well, at this point, office guidance really isn't laid out, so it's sort of still under the maximize telecommuting to the degree possible. We do get those complaints. That's something that's really hard to evaluate. And we end up really deferring to the employer's judgment in those situations. Plexiglass is a workable substitute for distance if it's a large enough shield. Basically it needs to be at least a foot and ideally 2 feet above head height, and it needs to come down to the work surface. So just having the equivalent of a portable sneeze guard that's 18 by 12 at the worker's head doesn't really substitute. Another thing to be conscious of that a lot of people are finding a workable alternative to the facial coverings, especially employees where you want them to engage and smile and make contact, is given that we're trying to protect against droplet transmission, a face shield. They don't have to be like a welder wears, but a face shield that covers the face works perfectly well and allows people to see. And for some people, it's much more comfortable to wear the shield that rests on your head rather than actually have something that's tied up against your mouth.
Yeah, we've made those available here at the chamber, and a lot of people find those much more comfortable and easier to wear.
Well, as we discussed, I'm mostly still at my house. If I had to wear the mask continuously, I'd buy a face shield.
Yeah. So are there any differences for self-employed people, say hairdressers, realtors?
Okay. So in terms of what the governor's executive order requires, no. In terms of my jurisdiction to enforce the governor's executive order, yes. If there's not an employer-employee relationship, Oregon OSHA does not have jurisdiction. Now, there are some circumstances where the employer and even the ostensible employees think of it as an independent contractor situation, and the nature of the direction of the control of the work site is such that we believe that it's actually an employer-employee relationship. Everybody knows from the public statements that is one of the issues with the Glamour Salon. There's no question that they were in violation of the executive order. The question is that she's arguing is that we don't have jurisdiction because they're all independent contractors. We wouldn't have issued that citation if we didn't believe that they were employees under our statute. And in hairdressers, some taxi cab operations, there is frequently a difference of opinion between us and the folks who are engaged. I think real estate agents, the nature of the broker relationship makes it clearer who's independent and who's not in an office. But really, we will always look closely at any relationship where the independent contractor, the ostensible independent contractor, is a captive independent contractor who only works for one entity as an independent contractor. That doesn't feel very independent. Now, the nature of the direction and control can still get there, but that's certainly anytime we encounter that, we'd look at it closely. And if we were doing one of those inspections, that's almost entirely what the discussion ends up being about when the other question is, are you closed or are you open? The other thing I do want to make sure I mention before we run out of time, I guess we've got plenty of time. You may hear a rumor that a friend of your cousin was cited because we walked up on a site and we offered to shake hands. And when the worker shook hands, we either cited the worker or cited the employer. That's just absolute BS. It's not even like somebody, as near as I can tell, it wasn't even somebody pretending to be us. It's one of those urban legends that has developed, and I have had people swear that they're certain this happened in radically different circumstances in radically different locations. Now, what we do believe happened early on is we did have some people who self-appointed themselves to be OSHA inspectors and offered to to also collect the penalty on site. We don't issue citations on site. We certainly don't collect penalties on site. So anytime somebody tells you you can go ahead and pay the penalty directly to them, that's clearly not ours. And we will always start by presenting our credentials if we're actually initiating an inspection. We may slip, we've done spot checks where we've actually, especially with public facing businesses, we've looked to see if they were open or in operation, if they'd implemented social distancing practices. I actually tested this concept to see how easily we could do it myself. And I did that by going to Lincoln City and doing, I think, 8 of them. And out of those 8, I crossed the threshold of one establishment just so that I could turn my head both ways and look around. Everything else I did from outside. Those aren't inspections. We can't issue citations because of them. And we know in those circumstances, we normally won't engage and won't identify ourselves, because as soon as we present our credentials, that by definition is an inspection.
Well, and like you were saying, if you had a complaint from a business or, on a business, then they would know that. You would give them a chance to follow up. Normally,
yes. Certainly in the COVID-19, almost certainly. It's not a guarantee, and in normal times, it only applies to about half of our complaints. And in some cases, if somebody calls us and files a complaint saying there are 3 roofers working without fall protection, we're not going to call the employer and say, hey, we hear you've got 3 roofers on your site working without fall protection. We're going to go do an inspection.
Right. And I just saw on your site that there was a chimney cleaning company, I believe, that was cited for unsafe employee practices.
COVID-19 business, we still have our regular book of business as well.
Right. It hasn't controlled everything we do. Just feels like everything we do. All right. I didn't see any other questions in the chat. I would just like to say that you've got some very good educational online videos on your website.
Thank you. Yes, we really have tried to up our game on the online video and online training, and I have some very smart folks who generally are younger than I, who are very good, and sometimes the only challenge I have is persuading them that it doesn't need to be perfect. We aren't going to submit it for an Academy Award, and really you can. It's time to let the child be born. But I'm glad you mentioned that. And I should also say we do consultations. I mean, if you are interested in what happens from an Oregon OSHA perspective, you can request a consultant, and we'll either come out or engage with you virtually in these times. And it's completely no risk. They will make recommendations. If they point out a bunch of stuff that's in violation of our rules, and unless they're one of the federally funded folks, you completely ignore them. That's foolish. I don't know why you'd ask us to come out just to ignore what we tell you, but it does not generate an enforcement referral. It is a completely advisory process.
All right, so next question. Have you had specific complaints from housekeepers over concerns for their safety in cleaning lodging facilities after guests leave? Good question.
Okay. No, I don't believe so. I'm cycling through 5,000. We've had complaints from office cleaning crews, but I don't believe we've had complaints from lodging facility housekeepers, which frankly is probably a greater risk than the office. But I don't believe we have gotten any of those complaints. I've had the concern raised in conversations. It's a little bit like agriculture farm workers. there are a lot of concerns about what's happening and we don't get many complaints, that's really where a lot of the lodging hospitality stuff would fall to. Some worker advocates raise the concern, but if we've had a complaint on it, we certainly haven't had many.
All right, but just to reiterate, if you were a business owner and you have questions, you can always call and either do a video conference or have an on-site visit to make sure you're in compliance.
Yeah. It's, you know, that when we're doing inspections, we pretty much have to go on site because we obviously aren't going to assume that the employer is going to point the camera at the unguarded saw. In a consultation, the employer is going to point the camera at the saw and say, do I have that guarded right? So it works a little bit better and can let us maintain our distance. And you know, minimizing our unnecessary presence in work sites isn't just about protection of my employees, although that's part of it. It's also about protection of you and your employees and your customers. If we were going into as many work sites as we usually do, one of the problems is we go into multiple work sites, and so we become a potential transfer of contamination. And so that's one of the things that we try to strike the right balance in terms of on-site and virtual, which is of course why we're not all having a meeting in the chamber offices in Lincoln City.
Right. Aside from the fact it's not big enough, but you know, we won't go there. So another question, if an employee shares with their coworkers that they have a sore throat, but it's from allergies and I feel fine, should I, or how should I advise them? Can or should I encourage or require them to pursue testing?
You really probably can't require them to pursue testing there because they're not, if they're conscious of having allergies. You can encourage it. You can offer to pay for it. Although most of those costs are being mitigated in various ways anyway. Probably more important is it depends on how their allergies manifest. If they sneeze and cough, which I do, I have allergies and it turns into a chronic cough and triggers my asthma and I sound like a 40-year smoker. If you may want to look at putting a facial covering on them even when they're well over 6 feet apart. Because if they're sneezing or coughing, they are projecting farther than 6 feet, and you really need to look at probably a 15-foot span. And I would just control them as a source control, because whether they're symptomatic or not from COVID, if they're an asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic or mildly symptomatic person from the COVID standpoint, they're still more likely to project that virus because of the other symptoms that they're attributing correctly to the allergy. And I think that's one thing to be conscious of. The other thing, you know, I don't know if anybody has a gym in this group, but if you do, the governor's guidance says 6 feet. Forceful exertion, when you've got people in forceful exertion, I would consider the fact that their zone of danger gets larger. When you've got people singing, unfortunately, one of the lessons we learn at churches is, that the singing clearly is a risk point. I would use a larger space.
Well, and especially right now, it's all about making your customers feel comfortable. So anything that you can do to make them feel comfortable.
It's when I'm coughing, I don't spend my Sunday afternoon in my wife's store. Even normally, she usually throws me out because it sounds so terrible. But right now, people would probably be throwing a garbage bag over me and carrying me out the door because it is a terrible cough when I cough.
So another question, I've had calls here at the chamber. I had one that wondered, and I've seen it, in various places, that not wearing a mask could be a Class C misdemeanor following a $1,250 fine. Is there ever an instance that would happen?
Well, we don't enforce Class C misdemeanors. So the governor's executive order, violation of public health guidance under the governor's executive order, technically is a Class C misdemeanor. That requires it to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt by a law enforcement officer and cited and pursued in that context. There has been none of that enforcement. And specifically with regard to facial coverings worn by customers, the governor, in the same guidance where she was saying they would be required, said that members of the public would not be ticketed and certainly would not be subject to criminal sanctions. And so I think really, and from our standpoint, whether it's the worker or the customer or whomever else, it's the employer and the business owner that we expect to control that behavior. So we would look to the employer, and obviously if you've got one customer who insists on taking it off, we're going to expect you to do reasonable enforcement in the store. The enforcement on the street, the enforcement in the park, anything like that falls outside our jurisdiction. And to the best of my understanding, nobody is actually going to be enforcing it now. It is a declared standard and expectation. And I will say, personally, I've read all the stuff. You may see a YouTube video that says OSHA says face masks are bad, don't do any good, and will deplete your oxygen levels. If you ever see that Facebook or that YouTube video, look at the link to federal OSHA's guidance that they put in it, which is very helpful and doesn't say what they say in the video. It's one of those, if I put the footnote in, nobody will actually read it. Federal OSHA is entirely comfortable with the use of facial coverings, as is the Centers for Disease Control, as is Oregon Health Authority, as is Oregon OSHA. Anybody who wants to argue the point needs to not appeal to us as authority. And there's another popular strain on Facebook where people say, I'm OSHA 10 and OSHA 30 certified, and so I can speak authoritatively to this. Well, that's a 10-hour course and a 30-hour course. That's what 10 and 30 mean in that context. I've been in this business for 25 years. I'm a certified safety professional. I'm actually not OSHA 10 or OSHA 30 certified, but I'm pretty sure I know more about these issues than they do. And there really is no risk, other than people with a particular medical condition, there's no risk to wearing the face covering if you take it off periodically and launder it. And in the current environment, you are helping to protect your friends and neighbors. And the governor wouldn't, whatever the enforcement is, the governor wouldn't be requiring it if it weren't for the fact that the Oregon Health Authority has strongly encouraged it, as frankly have we.
All right, good to know. So are there any other questions? If you have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask those. All right, it doesn't look like. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for coming on today. It's been very helpful.
I appreciate it and appreciate the conversation. And it is, even though we didn't have that many questions or back and forth, it's good to get out in the real world occasionally, even if only in a virtual sense. So
right. We feel like we're together, right?
Thank you for putting it.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. This will be recorded.